Welcome back to part 9 of our series, Finding the Kingdom of Heaven. Now, in our previous sessions, we began recognizing that the Christian movement, which began as a simple message, with a simple pattern, as we talked about, in the first century, it had started to transform into something totally different than what we see today. It has become a religion of multiple ritualisms, some of them with statues, and some have objects of worship. Some of them maintain separate levels of hierarchy, with certain men and women wearing special clothing or robes. In fact, that was mimicking the official attire of the ancient Roman empires we spoke about last time. And I left you with this question. Since none of these things existed when the apostles were alive, how and why specifically did all of this come about? Well, it didn't happen overnight. Obviously, it was a slow and a gradual process. And so now we want to peel back the layers and look a little deeper at the details from the historical record and observe this process unfolding. If you recall, several sessions back, I mentioned how the pattern was established by the apostles during the first century, and at that time it consisted of a plurality of elders, in other words, more than one in each local congregation. I also mentioned that these men were referred to as overseers or bishops, and these are terms which were used interchangeably for the same office. We can find that in Acts chapter 20, 17 and 28, and then in Titus chapter 1. The only other position of office, which I don't think I mentioned before, well, that was of a deacon. Now, deacons were appointed to carry out specific tasks on behalf of the congregation. In fact, we have an example of that first happening in Acts chapter 6, where men were appointed to serve in the distribution of food when that need arose. The point is this was the complete hierarchical structure in the first century. There was no singular person acting as the head elder or bishop over a congregation, let alone over multiple congregations. That's not what it looked like in the first century. So how and when did this all change? Well, the first significant shift away from the New Testament pattern was the rise of what is called as monoepiscopacy. And it didn't take long. During the early second century, we see the elevation of one elder being placed above the other elders in a local congregation. Previously, I referred to him as the presiding elder, but his official position became known as the bishop. The Greek word there was episkopos. The other men, well, they retained their title as elders from the Greek word presbyteros. And so this created a three-tiered structure in a local church. You had the one bishop, he was at the top of the structure, then you had the council of elders under him, and then finally you had the deacons. An early advocate for this structure was Ignatius of Antioch, who, writing around 110, he urged churches to be unified under their one bishop. Then, over the next 2 centuries, we see the expansion of this initial man-made structure into something that was also never part of the original pattern. As congregations grew and multiplied in different cities during the 3rd and 4th century, the bishop of the church in any prominent city of a Roman province, which is called a metropolis, well, he began to exercise authority over the bishops in the smaller towns and the rural areas of that province. This leading bishop, well, he was called the city bishop, or the official name was the metropolitan. This was a crucial step in the development of the regional hierarchy. The bishops in the smaller towns or rural areas were sometimes called country bishops, and they were subordinate to the metropolitan. And then from there into the 4th and 5th century, we see the rise of what was called the patriarchs, who were bishops of the most prominent cities of the Roman Empire. They held authority even over the metropolitans. Initially, the term used for these higher level influential bishops was often called archbishop. The term patriarch, well, that became the standard title for them, and that's from the Greek word papas, meaning father, which was initially an affectionate title for any bishop. In other words, not just one bishop, but any bishop could be called Pappus. And then over time, the term Pappus, well, that became especially associated with the bishops of Alexandria and most famously Rome. Each bishop or Pappus, well, they had full control of the city and its surrounding areas, which each one ruled over. And then, towards the latter part of the 6th century, the Bishop of Rome, well, he started claiming the title in a little more exclusive sense. And that didn't sit well with the other papas. AD 588 is an excellent historical marker. It was the year that the Patriarch John IV of Constantinople, also known as John the Faster, well, he adopted the title Ecumenical Patriarch, implying total authority over the entire Christian world. Well, this was forcibly condemned by the Bishop of Rome, Gregory the Great, who saw this as a sign of pride and usurping of authority. This event highlights the immense power that had been consolidated in these major Christian centers. This was a stark contrast to the servant leadership model of the 1st century eldership, which was established again by the apostles. And so by this time, you now have 5 major Christian centers of the Roman Empire. You had one at Rome, another one at Constantinople, you had Antioch, Alexandria, and then Jerusalem. These were the 5 major sees, as they were called. The term see comes from the Latin word sedes, which means seat. In an ecclesiastical context, it refers to the official seat or throne of a bishop. It was also called cathedra. Therefore, any city or area with a resident bishop, well, it constituted a see. These 5 sees eventually became known as the patriarchates, and their collective governance is often referred to by historians as the pentarch. In other words, rule by 5. And so, since all 5 patriarchs consider themselves to be equal rulers of the Christian church, you can understand why Gregory the Great, the Patriarch at Rome, well, he objected to the Patriarch of Constantinople claiming to be the universal bishop. And so we see a major rivalry for the universal leadership. However, Gregory's protest was largely unsuccessful. He wrote letters, passionate letters, not only to John IV, but also to Emperor Maurice, arguing that the title was proud. It was blasphemous. He said it was the sign of the precursor to the Antichrist. In fact, here's his famous quote: "I say it without least hesitation. Whoever calls himself the universal bishop or desires the title is, by his pride, the precursor of Antichrist." Close quote. Wow, that's amazing. But here's the problem that Gregory had. It didn't go anywhere. Emperor Maurice, well, he was based in Constantinople, the current Roman capital. Remember, Emperor Constantine, he moved the capital from Rome to Constantinople back in the 4th century. And Maurice's political interests, well, they were aligned with his own patriarch, not the patriarch over there in Rome. And so Maurice saw that the title was a way to elevate the status of the imperial capital's see. He essentially brushed off Gregory's theological and pastoral concerns, viewing the dispute as a matter of ecclesiastical pride and rivalry. And so, despite Gregory's powerful arguments, nothing was done. Nothing was done to revoke the title. And the Roman emperor, well, he continued to support his patriarch, John IV, in Constantinople. Are you starting to get the picture on how men have left the true pattern of the body of Christ and turning it into something that it was never meant to be? And here is where the political situation takes a dramatic and a decisive turn, even further away from the original pattern. In AD 602, Emperor Maurice and his family were brutally murdered. He was overthrown by a rebellious centurion by the name of Phocas. Then he seized the imperial throne right there in Constantinople. He was a tyrant, and his rule was illegitimate and precarious, and so he desperately needed to secure political allies. Now, Gregory the Great, well, he had already died in 604, and after the very brief reign of his successor, a second man named Boniface, he became the Bishop of Rome, and that would be in AD 607. Now, Boniface, before becoming the bishop in Rome, he had previously served as Gregory's representative over there in Constantinople. You know, sort of like our ambassadors today. And he had a good relationship with Phocas, the illegitimate emperor. And so, seeing an opportunity to gain the support of the influential Roman see and simultaneously undermine his rivals right there in Constantinople, Emperor Phocas issued an imperial decree in 607. This decree repudiated the claim of the Patriarch of Constantinople and explicitly declared that, quote, the see of Blessed Peter, the Apostle, should be the head of all the churches, end quote. By this emperor's sole authority, he conferred the very title of universal bishop upon Boniface III and all future successors in Rome. The authority given to the Bishop of Rome was a purely political and imperial decree given by a tyrant to secure a political alliance. Now, I spent a lot of time on these particular historical events because this is a critical moment in history. The supremacy of the Roman bishop, which was once argued against on theological grounds by everyone, but especially by the great Gregory I, was now established by the secular power of a murderous emperor for political gain. This is a major turning point that has affected the evolving organization of a secular church, which will have a huge impact on how so-called Christianity has evolved, as we're going to see. And so let's stop right here for now, because in our next session, we want to look at the details on how these events had such an impact on the course of history regarding what is commonly called the church. So I want to thank you for being here. And again, I look forward to our next session together. I hope you have a great rest of your day.